come here, I realized again, age has some, not many, but some advantages. One of the greatest advantages for me is that after so many years, you have found so many friends. And quite a number of them are collected here. Fred, we know each other since now. Adam, Michael was Jaime, we were together. Leszek. So I could continue for a while. I think it's always, I took care that everybody got strong coffee, because giving a lecture after lunch is very dangerous. It reminds me, Fred mentioned that I'm from the University of Würzburg, and there was a famous sociologist and economist in the late 19th century. They were all together, so economists were not such concentrating on studying and lecturing economists. So it was William Brentano, and he wrote his memoirs, and there's one chapter about the University of Würzburg. This chapter starts, he was at the University of Frankfurt. So he fell in love with a young student, and she decided to move to Würzburg. And so he had to join. And then his chapter on Würzburg starts saying, I went to Würzburg, there I learned nothing. And then he explained his bad experiences, and then there's a paragraph saying, I know it almost by heart, because from time to time, not every year, on suited occasions, I've quoted it, giving lectures to my students when they were tired. So, and they said, the worst case was a professor of public finance. Yeah. I had always to add that this is not a reference to living people, because students would immediately have been reminded of that. But it was a worst case, and a small number of students, and he said it was always in the afternoon, and it was very often his colleagues, students fell asleep. And he said, on a very hot afternoon, I fell asleep too. And then he said, when I woke up, I saw the professor also had fallen asleep. So the only thing I can promise, I will not fall asleep during my speech. Which is on the euro currency without a state. And in spite of the strong efforts by Fred, I appreciate that very much that you campaigned for my book. These attempts have been totally unsuccessful so far. Mervyn King had invited to the Bank of England for the launch of my book, and it was a day, and I thought I had organized everything very well. Gave 5 interviews, for example, to BBC, and they said, Professor Issing, welcome in London. You are here for the launch of your book. What is your opinion on the recent financial crisis? And I'm afraid today it's the same reaction. We are so concentrated on current issues, especially if they are of such a dimension. But nevertheless, when the dust has disappeared one day, we come back to fundamental issues, and I think the euro, its existence, its success, is one of these issues on which I will now elaborate a bit. Let me start far in the past. The origin of the word Europe lies deep in Greek mythology. It is a purely geographical term. The Hellenic poet Moschus called Europe the other continent, the place to which the bull carries the beautiful princess from Tyre on his back. Up until today, the geographical element remains one facet of a concept that has broadened into other spheres. Yet, even in geographical terms, we find it hard to determine the boundaries of what we call Europe. And for the other dimensions, this has become still more difficult. In his book, The Birth of Europe, Jacques Le Goff described the layers, as he called them, which form the foundations of Europe. This is not the appropriate place to pursue this, and many other interesting approaches to exploring the origins of Europe. In a splendid lecture at the Center for Financial Studies in Frankfurt, Karina Lehmann remarked on this connection, I quote, "Right from the beginning, and more especially in recent times, Europe has always been a unity in diversity." By the way, Jean-Claude Trichet will give a lecture in this series, which I've created, and he will talk on the 16th of March next year on Europe, cultural identity, cultural diversity. So I knew that he could not resist to the temptation of speaking of this, despite all the work he has to shoulder in these days. I continue with the quote. "Its culture has grown from Greek, Roman, Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and humanist roots. The core ideas have always been liberty, human dignity, and responsibility, which have increasingly been protected by democratic institutions. In this sense, the Iron Curtain excluded the dictatorships in the East from Europe, politically speaking. But large sections of the population, notably the intelligentsia, refused to accept this segregation." I think Leszek is confirmed what I'm saying. From 1945, the West basically appropriated the term Europe and claimed it for its own sphere of influence. Even in the first steps towards integration, with initially only 6 member states, people were not afraid to speak of the European coal and steel community. This choice of terminology continued inter alia in the European Economic Community, the European Monetary System, and finally the European Monetary Union. The openness towards new countries only partly mitigates this claim, since in the end it is the members who determine who may join and who not. It remains to be seen how many will ultimately reside in the house called Europe. It would be tempting, although I dare say ultimately not very fruitful, to speculate further about the terminological aspects and their factual basis, for example, about what it means that the English, even today, talk about Europe as something from which they are separated by the channel. In his famous speech in Zurich in September 1946, Winston Churchill foreshadowed this attitude in speaking of Europe as a family to which Great Britain, with its interests centered on the Commonwealth, did not feel it belonged. One may wonder where its special role is today outside its relations with the US. After 1945, efforts were directed above all to preventing a recurrence of the horrors of the 2 world wars at any price. The objective of European integration in the West was clearly political in nature. There could be no question of embarking on a major project with common state structures and a sizable number of countries. Thus, high-flown plans for the Council of Europe, which finally came into being on 5th of May 1949, turned out to be illusory. With respect to European integration, the Council proved rather to be a blind ally. Successful initiatives could only be expected from concrete projects with a smaller group of countries as nucleus. What far-sighted politicians at the time realized was indispensable, and with hindsight was obvious. There was no getting around the need for a lasting reconciliation between the arch-enemies France and Germany as the kernel of European integration. On 9th of May 1950, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman announced that the French government, I quote, proposes that Franco-German production of coal and steel as a whole be placed under a common high authority within the framework of an organization open to the participation of the other countries of Europe. The production of coal and steel, the material basis for warfare, was to be removed from national responsibility and placed under a supranational authority, the objective being Schuman again, that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The Schuman Plan of 1950 may justifiably be regarded as the trigger that started the process of European integration moving, a process that has since then repeatedly stalled and suffered setbacks, but has each time been spurred on and imbued with new momentum. With the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community, the Schuman Plan became a reality. Since that time, France, Germany, Italy, and the three Benelux countries have been at the heart of European integration. Even if the motive for setting up the European Coal and Steel Community was purely political, tellingly the initiative came from a foreign minister. The political end used the means of economic cooperation. It soon emerged that the economic route was the obvious one to take, and likely also the only viable one, in order to advance in further reaching goals as well. This became clear first of all with the failure of efforts to make progress along political lines. This was true both of the plan for a European defence community and of the proposal to set up a European political community. After their initial, I would call it founding euphoria, those responsible were forced to recognize that, as Schuman had realized from the start, Europe will not be made all at once, but could only be advanced step by step, not through overarching concepts, but through concrete achievements. Following a series of initiatives, the Foreign Ministers' Conference at Messina in early June 1955 set in motion the process that will lead to the creation of a European Economic Community and Euratom, etc. It started on 1st of January 1958, and the EEC began with the same 6 countries that had already belonged to the European Coal and Steel Community. After a number of failed attempts in January 1973, the EEC was enlarged to include further 3 member states, namely Great Britain, Ireland and Denmark, and then enlargement, etc. went on. It's quite interesting to reread the negotiations on the case of UK accession, with Britain being torn between the desire to join on the one hand and its Commonwealth links and Atlantic considerations on the other, as well as the attitude of France, chiefly embodied in the resistance of its President de Gaulle, were particularly revealing of the political interests and positions that lay behind the economic considerations. The European Economic Community was ultimately absorbed into the European Union in 1992. It may be regarded as the most successful integration project in history. The fall of the Iron Curtain had opened up the possibility of eastward enlargement. The fact that the Union meanwhile numbers 27 members, with more hoping to join, testifies to its attractiveness, which it owes to its undeniable success. Looking at the process of European integration since the end of the Second World War, I think the following elements stand out. First, while the motivation was political, the means adopted was that of economic convergence and integration. Second, this end could not be achieved by further sectoral integration along the lines of the European Steel and Coal Community, but only through an approach that embraced the national economies in their entirety. Third, again, unlike the European Coal and Steel Community, the community did not take the path of a supranational authority with centralized planning powers, but aimed for the establishment of a single internal market. In principle, economic relations within the community should not differ from the processes within a single nation state. The aim for market integration could only be achieved through competition that was free of distortions. Even if, over the decades, Those in positions of responsibility have never lost sight of the political objective of European integration. None of the attempts to achieve this goal by a direct route got off the ground. The train bound for Europe ran essentially on a track labeled economy. The start of Water Union raised integration to a new level. On the one hand, the introduction of a single currency represents the completion of the single market. The risk of exchange rate changes creates uncertainty and, depending on the circumstances, drives a greater or smaller wedge between decisions such as on investment inside or outside the national territory and hence the currency area. The crisis of 1992-93 was a further drastic reminder of the dimension of this risk. Abrupt revaluations or devaluations of individual currencies, in the case of the D-Mark-Lira exchange rate by more than 30%, changed the terms of competition at a stroke and provoked calls for restrictions on intra-community merchandise trade. In the meantime, the wherewithal for potential speculative attacks on individual currencies has increased by several orders of magnitude. Just imagine, for instance, what waves of speculation would have been unleashed on the foreign exchange markets by the most recent crisis in the financial markets if he had still been living under a regime of national currencies. I think the popularity of the euro has dramatically changed, at least outside the euro area. Those who wanted to be already under the protective roof of the euro. But this is one of the advantages of the euro which go more or less unnoticed. But his thinking with or without the crazy economists do this exercise from time to time, but not people who just take things for granted. Just imagine massive interventions where the central banks would not have been able to prevent the collapse of the exchange rate system. Not only economic, but also political tensions would have been bound to ensue. And with a single internal market and the four freedoms, movement of people, goods, etc., have survived such a shock unscathed, I doubt. To this extent, therefore, the introduction of the single currency extends and completes the process of integration via the currency, via the economy. At the same time, abolishing national currencies and introducing a single one in their place has ramifications beyond the economic sphere. This was strongly felt in Germany to give up the sovereignty, the D-Mark, etc., the transfer of sovereignty of monetary policy from the Bundesbank to the European Central Bank was understood as a deep change in the institutional arrangement under which Germans lived, and the same is true for France and other countries. The central bank on its own does not make a state, but it is an important element of national sovereignty and the bearer of major policy responsibility. Over and above this, the common currency can help the citizens in the various countries identify with Europe. During a debate in the European Parliament in 1966, the German Member of Parliament Dichkan still trusted in the symbolic power of a coin with the image of a shapely young woman on the back of a bull. You see, I never come back from my origins. My first two semesters were on Latin and Greek, so it always makes a nice quote. So I never expected that I could ever use it. So today's euro banknotes and coins lack such an appeal. But let's be honest, who nowadays would bet on people being familiar with the Greek myth? We need to look to other sources in order to forge a sense of identity. Even if the abolition of national currencies and introduction of the single currency mark the crossing of the Rubicon of purely economic integration, they first of all extend the process that began the dismantling of trade barriers and bring the integration of the market to completion. I skip now the discussion on the different philosophies prevalent at that time in France and Germany, was the economist group and the monetarist, not the quantity theory of the economists, but which were which had a very big influence on the process of monetary integration. Let me continue with referring to the famous dictum by Jacques Rueff, who declared already in 1950, l'Europe se fera par la monnaie ou ne se fera pas. Europe is created by the currency, money or not. So it was the idea that the currency is the driver, is the path through which political union could be achieved. I have some other quotes, for example, from President Chirac, from the former president of the Republic of Germany, Weizsäcker, who strongly believed that we get a common foreign policy by the euro. An economist is somewhat unable to understand the transmission process of that. But let me just mention that. I think there's every reason, from a central banker's point of view, and I might never give up this attitude, every reason to warn against overburdening expectations of the single currency with a political mission. In any event, central bankers did well to steer clear of any such ambitions. The European Central Bank, for example, made it clear from the outset that it would not attempt either to promote or to hinder the international role of the euro. We always saw it as a demand-driven market process. In the Bundesbank, in the 1970s, the Bundesbank did not wish this international role of the demand to emerge. We were concerned about international responsibilities, but markets, other central banks didn't care. You cannot control this. You cannot control this process. But this is only about the economic international role of the euro, not going beyond economics. I think I should give you this quote. Expectations of the single currency reached their climax in the raptures of the then Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Guterres at the Madrid, summit of heads of state and government in 1995. I quote, "When Jesus resolved to found a church, he said to Peter, 'You are Peter the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. You are the euro, and upon this new currency we will build our euro.'" This sounded like a shiver. So. Quite obviously, it was precisely the expectations of monetary union that went beyond purely economic aspects, which on the other side aroused resistance among politicians who were opposed above all to political consequences. When I wrote this sentence, I thought I should insert a quote, and I was sure that I would find it in publications of Margaret Thatcher. So I did. She did not mince her words. I quote, "The most substantial manifestation of the design to create a fully fledged superstate so far is a European single currency. This project is essentially political rather than economic. The power to issue a currency is a fundamental attribute of a sovereignty, not some symbolic or technical matter." She deplores the loss of sovereignty in monetary policy and fears the same effect on fiscal and tax policy. In her view, the stability and growth pact imposed by the Germans as a price for accession to monetary union already makes the consequences manifest and is unacceptable for sovereign states. As for the rest, the entire project cannot succeed. I quote again, "I believe that the European single currency is bound to fail, economically, politically, and indeed socially. So the timing, occasion, and full consequences are all necessarily still unclear." In German, we have a saying, those who are called dead live especially long. So this leaves open. We talked about the future of the two pillars, and it's It's not for eternity, but for long. And here this prediction leaves out any date. But it indicates the resistance to the consequences of multi-union, and I think these are serious arguments. As we can see, therefore, there was a broad spectrum of hopes or fears bound up with the introduction of the single currency. This divergence of opinions reflects the dual nature of multi-union, with, on the one hand, the completion of the single market, and, on the other, profound changes to the institutional arrangements of the European community. This is also revealed not least in the fiscal policy consequences. So let me develop a few thoughts on the Stability and Growth Pact. This pact is intended to close the exposed flank of a monetary union without a unified state. The rules of the pact aim essentially at avoiding excessive indebtedness of the part of individual countries and at keeping changes in aggregate national budget deficits in line with the stability-oriented monetary policy of the single central bank. Neither the pact nor the economic logic of monetary union entails completely surrendering sovereignty in, for example, matters of tax policy. Nor would national governments and parliaments be willing to do so. Western democracy is rooted in the control of public revenues, taxes, and expenditures by parliament. Governments are accountable to their national parliaments and ultimately to their voters at home. Were tax and fiscal policy as a whole to be made a European causa, there would indeed have to be a European statehood, a European government, and the legitimacy conferred by a parliament elected on established democratic criteria, one person, one vote. In a sense, the Stability and Growth Pact balances on this knife edge. Monitoring takes place at the European level through the European Commission, but decision-making, not least on sanctions, lies in the hands of the majority of national governments. As signatories to this pact, the national governments accepted these rules. But could one really expect the Council of Ministers to see its way to imposing sanctions, especially on a big country, in the case of an excessive deficit? And if so, will the sanctions actually be enforced? What happens if a national government is not just encouraged, but perhaps even forced by the national parliament to disregard the rules? The logic of monetary union demands that the European obligation take precedence. Political reality at the national level may come into conflict with this. This reveals the tension that inevitably arises from a monetary union established under the roof of the unfinished house of political union. The call to give priority to European demands runs up against the barrier of national constitutions and sovereignty. This conflict cannot simply be resolved by gradually shifting competencies de facto from the national level to Europe. Nor can a substantial expansion of the European Union budget resolve this conflict. Under the existing institutional circumstances, political responsibility for higher transfer payments and their financing remains with the national governments, controlled by national parliaments and the national electorate. Political union cannot be attained by a foreign policy, nor through the back door by eroding national fiscal policy sovereignty. Any attempt to follow this path would be bound to lead to tensions that might even jeopardize the degree of integration that has been achieved today. Among the attempts at overcoming the tensions between European and national powers and responsibilities that are not just useless, but even dangerous, is the idea of creating a European economic government. I explain here in detail why I think this is, for me, it's a dangerous development. What we have with the Stability and Growth Pact and the ECOFIN, this is a kind of nucleus of an economic government, European government, which exactly matches the unfinished house of political union and the finished house of political union. And this is the test, keeping to the rules of the test, of the pact is the test for this European orientation. Let me make a few remarks on the current financial crisis in the context of the discussion of the European institutional arrangement. The financial market crisis and the resultant calls on policymakers to take action testify once again to the uncompleted nature of the political house. No country is unaffected by developments in the other member states. Where might one find a more telling example of spillover of external effects? And yet, it is extraordinarily difficult to strike the necessary balance between national and European level actions. In my judgment, what has been achieved on the European Council is extraordinary. It would probably not have been expected. Going it alone in response to the pressure of rapidly unfolding events may be understandable from a national perspective, but it is virtually bound to create typical beggar-my-neighbor situations, with a risk of sizable adverse effects on other member states. Unilateral action inevitably leads to competitive distortions. The principle of the single market calls for unified rules, and the community cannot and must not evade its responsibility in this regard. Unrestricted competition is the very foundation stone of an integration process that is based on market relations, and I think this was observed in the decision by heads of state and government. Quite a different matter, in my opinion, is the injection of money. To produce a system-wide effect, one would need to pool resources on a huge scale, but without being able to adequately specify their uses beforehand. I am convinced no government can go down this path without parliamentary assent and moreover popular approval. Even in times of crisis, the border between responsibility to Europe and national democratic legitimacy is not easily crossed. The financial market crisis, by the way, will give fresh impetus to the already long-debated calls for European solutions in banking, market and insurance supervision. This was exactly triggered that President Barroso wished to have a report on the situation, which is the Rossier group, which Balzerowicz and I are a member of this, and we have to prepare a report for the next spring summit. Helmut Kohl in 1991 voiced a widespread conviction, namely that not a union without political union is doomed to failure. 1991. Whatever one may understand by political union, the status quo certainly does not come up to expectations in this regard, and any fundamental advance in this direction in the foreseeable future is out of the question. The euro, therefore, looks likely to remain a currency without a state for some time to come. The embodiment of a process that for a paper currency is without historical precedent. What we have seen in the past, gold currencies, gold standard, we had, so to say, comparisons, but we had the gold fundament. Here it's paper currencies, and for that there is no precedent. So I want to conclude that, reminding what Kohl said, in that respect, one-sided start of monetary union on 1st of January 1999 created a constellation that, for want of a political complement, risks collapsing. Can monetary union function and survive without political union? To come back to my unsuccessful campaigning for my book, the last chapter of my book is on that, perhaps to trigger your appetite. Forging ahead with monetary union has, in a sense, given the community no choice but to create the further conditions needed for success alongside the provision that govern the ECB and its monetary policy. Briefly put, these comprise at a minimum. First, An institutional arrangement for the alignment of fiscal policy with the stability-oriented monetary policy of the European Central Bank. In institutional terms, this condition is fulfilled by the Stability and Growth Pact. The pact only needs to be observed. Second, the further requirement follows the criteria of the theory of optimum currency areas. Roughly speaking, and sufficient for practical functioning, this means creating the necessary flexibility in markets, above all in the labor markets, so that the single monetary policy can yield its full benefits. Here a great deal, undoubtedly, remains to be done, that the governments themselves have conceded, for example, at the Lisbon summit in 2000. Even if the criteria for a successful monetary union can still be improved after its inception, this will not happen automatically, but requires the appropriate reforms to be undertaken. Having spoken about optimal currency area, the criteria for an optimal currency area, I think we need further research to what extent these criteria are inevitably. I think financial integration, consumption smoothing, risk sharing are not substitutes for flexibility in markets, but are strong complements. And I think one of the reasons why the euro area, despite lack of flexibility, has worked so well in the monetary policy might be related to these effects. The further success, and in an extreme case, even the continued existence of European monetary union depends crucially on whether the two above-mentioned minimum conditions are met. Some proposals that go further in the direction of political union threaten rather to produce the opposite effect. This is true in particular of the call for the establishment of a social union alongside monetary union. To the extent that this means harmonizing social security at the highest level achieved among the member states and a further tightening of labor market rigidities, such ideas will likely complicate the working of the single monetary policy and be harmful to growth and employment. Under the prevailing circumstances, the operation of the single monetary policy and ultimately the cohesion of monetary union will depend importantly on whether those countries that for years have strayed from the average with markedly higher inflation rates and large current account deficits can bring themselves back to a sustainable position by following the course of national austerity. For the rest, the debate about moving further towards political union is centered mostly on areas that have little, if anything, to do directly with monetary union. One example is the calls for a common foreign and defense policy. This will only impinge on monetary union when the financing of ambitious projects becomes an issue. Whether the community will make progress in this area depends on political will and ultimately on the approval of the electorate. At any rate, political union can be attained through the back door of monetary union. During the Cold War period, the external threat fostered internal cohesion and the willingness to surrender national competencies. I come back to another example of history. Examples of such effects can be found a long way back in history. In the year 732, the Arab commander Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi came up against the army of the Frankish mayordomo Charles Martel near Tours. The chronicler chose to call the motley collection of soldiers from different tribes Europeans. After the battle had been won, the chronicler recounts Europenses recipiunt in patrias. They returned to their homelands. To conclude, let us return to the starting point. After 1945, efforts were concentrated on saving Europe from a recurrence of the horrors of two world wars. The objective of integration, initially confined to the West, was political in nature. It was more the force of circumstances than deliberate intention that subsequently led an initially small and then growing group of countries to pursue integration through a drawing together of the national economies. Today, the European Union stands between the single market that extends to all 27 members, the group of countries linked by a common currency, and the conflict over further steps in the direction of political union. What would a blueprint for the objective of political union look like from today? Jean Monnet once said, "If I were to begin again, I would begin with culture." Although much of the idea of Europe is founded on the values of its culture, would the community really have progressed very far if it had followed this path? There is no shortage of interesting ideas on how one might proceed. Whether they hold out any prospect of success is another matter. But there is one thing that no one who holds Europe dear should forget. Regardless of whether one considers the path taken to be the right one, or the outcome to be desirable, or would consider other constellations preferable. In its current form, Europe, the European Union, owes its attractiveness and its success overwhelmingly to the drawing together of the national economies via the market mechanism. With monetary union, the principle of competition has been joined at the European level by that of monetary stability, a stable currency, the euro. As economic theory and practical experience consistently tell us, monetary stability under a paper standard can only be ensured through a statute for the central bank that guarantees its independence in its decision-making and gives it a clear objective to maintain price stability. This knowledge and conviction found expression in the statute of the European Central Bank. The euro is a product of the will manifested in the Maastricht Treaty that money should be depoliticized, should be unpolitical. Should be money removed from the influence of governments, party political interests, and vote-winning considerations. Those who attack this statute evidently have quite different ideas of the right monetary constitution. If one strips away all the decoration from such statements, what remains is the intention to repoliticize money. To expose them as a renunciation of the principle of stable money is, to my mind, not just to follow economic logic and historical experience, but to properly defend what has been achieved today in the area of European integration. The economy and the currency are not everything and not even the most important thing. The most important achievement of policy in the post-World War II period has been to avoid any renewed outbreak of hostilities. Economic success has undoubtedly played a part in this. Economic success is no guarantee, but economic failure, low growth, and high unemployment are bound sooner or later to give rise not only to economic but also to political tensions. It is only under a regime of monetary stability that free citizens can successfully shape their own lives and that markets can function in an optimal way. Not for nothing did Lenin reportedly declare that the way to destroy bourgeois society is to debauch the currency. It remains to be seen how far the common currency, the euro, transcends the economic context to help foster a sense of identity and hence carry Europe further along the path to political union. A stable euro is an important pillar of the status quo. Any expectations that go beyond that are predicated all the more on the maintenance of monetary stability. Those who seek to undermine these principles do not just destroy the chances of stable money, such attacks also threaten Europe's chances of continuing to prosper. And this would also inevitably spell the end of hopes of achieving political union. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with a personal anecdotal remark. It was one day in the European Central Bank when, as many times, we had lunch together, and it was in this case just Christian Oyer, at the time Vice President of the ECB, and me. And we talked about anything in the world, and we just out of the sudden discovered the following experience. At the time when his father was prisoner of war in a German prisoners of war camp, my father was member of the occupation army in France. And around 50 years later, the two sons were sitting together, not just having lunch, but trying to bring forward a European project of great importance. I thank you for your attention.
Anders Åslund, Peterson Institute. You mentioned that you were against economic government in Europe and referred to the Stabilization and Growth Pact instead. But in extraordinary circumstances that you can be relieved from the budget discipline of the Stabilization and Growth Pact. And now we have extraordinary circumstances, and a reasonable guess would be that we will have that for 3 more years. Does that mean that no rules will apply, or what is your answer to that?
Just to leave the diplomatic attitude aside for a moment.
Please do.
This is dangerous if you encourage me.
I encourage you. He always does. We encourage you.
The revised Stability and Growth Pact was in the pipeline to be tested again in the context of slowing economies. This was obvious. And on top of that, we now have this crisis. So the revised treaty has this principle of special circumstances. I think nobody would deny that these are special circumstances. So I do hope that, I'm rather convinced, but let's say I do hope that the governments, the ECOFIN, will find a way to clearly keep the rules intact which apply in normal times. I think it can not easily, but it can be done.
Andre?
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. And if you allow me just to follow you something on one topic, European integration. On one hand, this is really quite a remarkable event over the last several decades. But on the other one, it will be one of the most important criteria to judge economic success. It will be economic growth. And if we look at the numbers, you will find that over the last quarter of century, European Union as a whole was actually lagging behind the United States. Having in mind that just the kind of similarity of both huge economic areas in the current world. And in the last year with this world financial crisis, it is widely believed that the crisis has been born in the United States, but the first victim was Europe. Europe is already in a recession for 2 consecutive quarters. The United States could be also, but 1 quarter late. So the question is, looks like yes, this European integration process and the whole this process is quite attractive, but in the long run, it seems to me that it looks like it does not deliver what is considered to be the best possible outcome. Compared to the United States, compared to Asia, compared even to Africa, Europe is growing with the slowest possible pace among the main regions of the world. How can we have, what kind of explanation would we have for that?
Let me first say that last week we had the 5th European Celebrating Conference, and one paper was trying to find out what was the consequence of multi-union on growth and employment, etc., and the author couldn't find any major impact on that. I think for me this kind of approach is totally misguided, because the question is, if you just compare the time series, then then you might get results like that. But I think the test is here again in the with or without. And what would have happened in Europe without the creation of the single currency, I think is easily to identify. And former colleague of mine, Vito Constancio, he is in his comments, in his contribution as a discussant, he said what we totally forget is what is the wealth effect. Take my country, Portugal. If you see the decline in interest rates and you apply it to the debt, the wealth effect of this is enormous. It's enormous. And second, I would say again, the euro has protected European member states against the consequences of the financial crisis in so far as on top of every financial market crisis we have had foreign exchange market crisis. So I think this is of extreme importance. And third point, I'm not satisfied with what was achieved during the first years of multi-union. And heads of state and government are neither. In the Lisbon summit I mentioned, they have decided to make Europe the most flourishing economy in the world. Unfortunately, we know this cannot be just decided. You have to work for that, to create the conditions. And I think the Europe, I'm not arguing that we should be satisfied with what has happened, but the lack is clearly identified. This just reminds me, once a year I was invited to go to the European Parliament to explain our policy, etc. And from year to year I explained that markets are not flexible enough, we need more incentive, etc. And parliamentarians reacted, this is boring. Every year you say the same. So next year, in a short introduction, I made the same point, and they said, you always with your central bank obsession about flexibility. I said, I forgot to mention that this paragraph was a quote from the consequences of the Lisbon summit. I just read what the Lisbon summit had summarized on the need of more flexibility, etc. So this is common knowledge. It's accepted by heads of state and government, documented several times, and here I think a lot has to be done. A lot has to be done. So this is a reason to be not satisfied. Insofar I fully agree with you.
Adam? Adam Hosen, Peterson Institute for International Economics. Otmar, thank you again for coming today. It's a great treat to have you. Continuing in the non-diplomatic blunt mode, if we all agree that one of the great victories of EMU, the creation of the euro, is that the smaller, weaker, poorer member states were not subjected to speculative attacks or exits when there was financial turbulence, does this cause you in any way to rethink possible acceleration of euro entry for the new members of the EU to the east? And secondly, given that Europe has been such a zone of stability in monetary terms, did it surprise you at all when there was the panic of the last couple months that most of the capital flew into US T-bills and not equally into Eurozone, and does that matter?
To start with the second question, it's indeed surprising, but there are different approaches in analyzing what is behind capital flows, and a lot of this, I've seen this argument, it sounds convincing to me, probably because it's confirming my priors. There's a lot of repatriation of American-owned capital from outside. So this would explain a lot, probably most of what we have seen. To your first question, I think what we have seen is, I think it had to be expected. I think the most extreme case is Denmark. Denmark has fixed the exchange rate of its krona at par to the, not at par, but without any ranges to the euro. So it's important conducting the monetary policy of the ECB. And in two referenda, people have rejected the idea of joining the euro. I think we all know for many political reasons. In the context of the recent financial crisis, it has turned out that even with the best monetary policy, etc., and a credible fixed exchange rate regime, there were attacks on Denmark. So it comes at a price in the times of crisis. And I could take other examples. So this certainly fosters the interest to join the euro. But at the same time, I think we should not forget that you have to prepare. Take the case of the Baltic countries, which seem to be so close to the euro in many respects for many years. But we have always mentioned you have high inflation, and you have still higher inflation to come in the pipeline, in the adjustment process. You have huge current account deficits, etc., etc. And as it turned out, I think they were wise not to join so far, or the decision that they are not allowed to join was certainly not without economic and political arguments.
Otmar, maybe just to link up Andre's question and Adam's, would it be too strong to say that the trade-off accepted by European countries in joining the Eurozone was to get the benefit, as you just described, of reducing the risk of crisis at the cost of somewhat slower growth, because monetary policy created for a wide union would inevitably be not quite right for the individual countries. And they did give up, at least to some important extent, national policy tools, both monetary policy and exchange rate policy, to join the union. So that could be quite a rational trade-off, a rational choice, but I don't think it's been quite posited that way. Would you think of that as a kind of explanation or rationalization of what's happened over the first 10 years of the euro as it has played out, particularly, as you said, the follow-on reforms in labor market and other policy to get more flexibility have not occurred?
I think if you are good enough prepared to join, then I wouldn't so much see this trade-off. I always refer this context to the case of Portugal. Portugal is a case for careful study for any country trying to, wishing to join the euro area. It started in rather good conditions, and it spoiled all advantages. And then the tools of depreciation of the currency, monetary policy are not more available. So to get out of the problem you have created yourselves. But politically, it's understandable. You do everything to be able to join, you are accepted, and then you relax. No? And when you relax, politically it's very difficult to continue the fiscal discipline, for example, which was not very much like before joining, but here you have an argument. So we've seen in the 90s that the intention to be among the first members to join has triggered tremendous efforts. Mid-50s, then 1950s, mid-90s, I would not have accepted that Germany, that the inflation rate of Italy would be below that of Germany. But it can be done. But in my discussions with many colleagues from countries wishing to join, politically my point is always a country must not just fulfill the convergence criteria, but the consequences of having lost the instrument of exchange rate and monetary policy to live with such a regime was politically accepted and shared by the people. This is key. This is key. Otherwise, you get economic and political tension thereafter.
I remember I always used to ask your colleague Hans Tietmeyer how many countries were now qualifying for the Deutschmark zone, which was then to become Euroland. And he always said 6.5. And I said, what's the half? And he said, Italy north of the Po. Mr. Giorno, never. And but eventually it happened and they did it. I'm Marco with you.
Mark Strauss-Kahn. I have two comments leading to two questions. One is domestic for the euro area and the other is international. As regards the domestic aspect, it goes back to the flexibility of markets. You've shown very clearly that the euro played the role of a shield which has prevented worse developments than the ones we have observed. The question, nevertheless, might be, did the euro play a sort of anesthetic role? Did it prevent further efforts to be done to flexibilize markets? That's the first question. And the second one was international. We've seen that the rise of the euro has not jeopardized the prevalence of the dollar, and that's for the best, because the worst would have been to see in the current circumstances a collapse of the dollar and a high increase of the cost to finance the public deficit. Now, you have highlighted the neither motto of the ECB as regards the role of the euro as an international currency. It is nevertheless the second international currency. And so, at the risk of overburdening its role, how far can it go? What can it do to contribute to the international monetary system stability?
It's difficult to speak in this house about the second question. You have worked on that, and your colleagues here. I must say, on this international role of a currency, I never understood the ambition. This comes by when the euro, when Dosenberg came into his office a bit later than me, and I knew around 10 o'clock he would call and say, Otmar, have you seen the euro has fallen again like a stone? This was when it went down to 83 cents. It was very clear that the euro was bound to become an international currency, representing such a huge economic area based on domestic stability, financial market integration, etc., political stability. This is unavoidable. And not all investors, central banks want to put all their eggs in the dollar basket. So diversification, this was bound to happen. And the question, will the euro overtake the dollar or not? This is nothing to be decided anywhere, to be wished anywhere. I think if the Europeans would wish to promote the euro, they would reach the opposite, because it would imply policies which would destabilize the currency and not stabilize it. So, and we know from history that the incumbent has many advantages, network advantages, etc. So this comes slowly, and in some market segments, etc., the euro is more or less equal to the role of the dollar. In others, on foreign exchange reserves, it's roughly 25%. Exchange rate changes change the picture all the time. The dollar is, let's say, 67. So, okay, it's fine. So it might change, and or not. I would expect these two currencies to remain for some time to come as the two leading currencies before the currency in the Far East will emerge into this role, and then we might have a kind of tripolar world. And then it's interesting to look into the literature of the 20s, 30s of last century, if this can be a stable world or not. These are the questions these are the questions. But I think this is for me a market-driven process and not in some markets, invoicing currencies, of course, politics play a role. And this has also, again, network effects. But the major impact comes from stability of the currency and stability and growth of the economic area. And also in the context, what you asked before, if the euro area would grow stronger, this would also support the role of the euro as an international currency, but not the other way around. To the own work, and the international role is a consequence of that, not the other way around. On the euro, what did you call it, anesthetic, just anesthetic, just working against reforms. There is some truth in that. One is what I mentioned before, case of Portugal, once you have joined, you relax on reforms. And there is another aspect. Certainly, when you look back, spreads between government bonds more or less have disappeared. More or less have disappeared. And this was certainly not conducive to fiscal solidity. So I remember in the 90s, I've forgotten how many seminars I attended, which were on, do we need a stability and growth pact? Can markets do the job? Well, there are strong believers in markets doing the disciplining work because of the spreads emerging currencies. I didn't believe in that. And the first years of the euro area have demonstrated that between countries with very low debt ratio, sound fiscal policies, and those countries for which this did not apply so much, spread was 20 basis points, something like that. In the meantime, this has changed. And I do hope it has a positive effect, because if spreads go in the dimension of 60, 70, 80 basis points, and you have a huge debt, this bites. And it will create tensions, but at the same time, I think it's an incentive. It might help the finance minister to say to his countrymen, to the colleagues in the cabinet, you see, if we continue like that tomorrow, we will have a spread of 100 basis points, etc., and this comes very costly. So this effect is there, and of course it's not positive.
Final question, Tedru.
Well, I want to join others in thanking you for a very thoughtful and, I would say, sophisticated and nuanced lecture. It was a pleasure listening to you, even if we didn't understand all the Latin and Greek. I was going to say, I thought maybe Mark Strauss-Kahn's question was slightly the other way around. Just a comment, right? Which is maybe because you have the second most important currency, does that mean you have the second most important responsibilities in the world? Which is a slightly different way of asking the question. But that's a comment. But the question I was going to ask you was related to the current turbulence. One of the big discussions about the European Central Bank and its role in the European project has been the presence or absence of a letter of last resort. I suspect that maybe this will be something that will be raised, discussed in your Lampelusi group. I don't know the full agenda there is. The Rosier, get my L's wrong. The Rosier group. You've probably been a member of the Lampelusi group too at some point. What do you think in terms of that issue, right? In terms of this current turbulence, right? Is a lack, or I mean, I'm not sure I never understood exactly what the debate is about, but is the lack of a lender of last resort, in some sense, part of the problem? Has it been an issue in your understanding of the euro area developments over the last year or so, or has it been proved to be a non-issue, and therefore is not something that should be on the list?
Thank you for your first remark on whatever you call sophisticated part of my speech, but as with my book, nobody is interested in that. It's nice to listen, but this is history. Now, if you look to the last 15 months of the ongoing financial crisis, the matter of lender of last resort was basically not the issue. It was partly seen as that, if you define it in Bechdorf's terms. This is organized in a way in the euro system which functions perfectly. The problem is about investing taxpayers' money. This is the issue. And here, of course, we are in a very difficult field. Because the central bank, of course, the European central bank cannot do it, not the national central bank, only with the guarantee of the, let's cut it short, of the finance minister. And here we have seen it in the case of Dexia, for example. What is it? What is a Dutch bank or a Belgian bank or a French bank? It's a European bank, and then taxpayers' money has to come from several sources. And this is difficult to sort out. And of course, the political structure of the European Union makes this clear. It can be solved probably only over the crisis weekend. In advance, it's very difficult. There are ideas around. I had a long discussion with Willem Borge. He said this is a dangerous arrangement. People will never, it was before it happened, will never be able to get an arrangement over a crisis weekend. I said they get it only over a crisis weekend. Because in advance, the problem is if you would identify the shares, it implies so much moral hazard. You transfer deposits, etc. So you can gain with this obligation. So I think we have to think about how to organize it better, because it's also not so comforting that, thinking that whatever happens over the weekend, they will find a compromise. If the sums are increasing and one finally minister gets out of the outrage, out of the room, will he come back? So the textbook, so to say, of such a meeting is very difficult, and almost to rely that crisis will trigger cooperation, it's not so comforting. But also here, it's not so easy, I would say.
Otmar, let me echo what Ted said by way of thanking you, praising you for your presentation. We deeply appreciate your being with us. We hope we will trigger at least a small boom in sales for your book. You can check on Amazon.com tomorrow and see if it's soared up to the bestseller list. And
I will change my hotel if it were.
Delighted to upgrade your accommodation. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the Whitmans once again for sponsoring the lecture. And Otmar, best of luck in all your current